The Torah reading this week, at least in the United States of America, is Parshat Chukat, which begins famously with the instructions for the red heifer, which is needed in order to maintain the purity of the Jewish people, especially in temple times. It's a prerequisite, and it's really the fact that we lack it today is where we get the source of not going on the Temple Mount ourselves, due to the fact that we're deemed to be ritually impure, lacking the paraduma. It's called the chok of the Torah. It's the law in the Torah that's the most difficult to understand. But we're going to look at chapter 20. And hopefully this won't be the class that's the most difficult to understand. Hopefully it'll make some more sense in a simple level. And that has to do with Moshe and Aaron hitting the rock instead of speaking to the rock. And this is a perplexing section of the Torah. We're going to take a look at it, and we're going to try to draw a few conclusions from it. If you have an art scroll stone chumash, we're going to look at Bamidbar Numbers chapter 20. And we're going to highlight a few specific verses, and we're going to make some references elsewhere too. But to pick up the narrative, there's a note in the stone chumash which is really important to know, and that is between the end of chapter 19 and the first sentence in chapter 20, there is a time lapse of 38 years, which is not written into the Torah. But everything we've read about until now took place within the year and a half of the Jewish people leaving Egypt. And now the Torah is going to focus on those events that happened toward the end of the 40 years of wandering in the wilderness, just before the Jewish people enter the land. And we'll see in this week's Torah reading is recorded the passing of Miriam and the death of Aaron, so that by the end of this week's Torah reading, Moshe alone is at the helm of the Jewish people, assisted by the 70 elders that were appointed after, not long after the sin of the spies. But there's a huge time lapse between the two. And let's take a look at the narrative in chapter 20. Page 843 in the stone chumash. The children of Israel, the whole assembly, arrived at the wilderness of Sin in the first month, and the people settled in Kadesh. Miriam died there, and she was buried there. There was no water for the assembly, and they gathered against Moshe and Aaron. So the connection of Miriam dying and the fact that there was no water is referred to by the rabbis that there was a Be'er Miriam, that the Jewish people throughout their 40 years of wandering in the wilderness drank from a miraculous rock that traveled around with them. And that rock was in the merit of Miriam. So when she passed away, the rock stopped giving water, causing panic for the people, and the people go through, unfortunately, and this is really a different generation of people than left Egypt, because almost all those people who left Egypt had already died out. But they revert to the usual thing. We're going to die here. We have no hope. We could have gone back to Egypt. What's going on here? And they seem to question Moshe and Aaron's leadership. Sentence 6, Moshe and Aaron went from the presence of the congregation to the entrance of the tent of meeting and fell on their faces. The glory of Hashem appeared to them. Hashem spoke to Moshe, saying, take the staff and gather together the assembly, you and Aaron, your brother, and speak to the rock before their eyes, that it shall give its waters. It shall bring forth for them water from the rock and give drink to the assembly and to their animals. Moshe took the staff from before Hashem as he had commanded him. Moshe and Aaron gathered the congregation before the rock, and he said to them, to the people, listen now, O rebels, shall we bring forth water from this rock? Then Moshe raised his arm and struck the rock with his staff twice. Abundant water came forth, and the assembly and their animals drank. Hashem said to Moshe and Aaron, because you did not believe in me to sanctify me in the eyes of the children of Israel, therefore you will not bring this congregation to the land that I have given them. They are the waters of strife, where the children of Israel contended with Hashem. and he was sanctified through them. And this really hangs in there. It's referred to at the end of the Torah also, just by reference. If you go to the book, the end of Deuteronomy, chapter 32, sentence 51, you will see right at the end of the Torah where Moshe has been pleading and praying to go into the land of Israel. And Hashem says, nope, because you did not believe in me sufficiently and you struck the rock, therefore you will not lead the people into the land. So this is really a very dramatic, history-altering moment in Jewish history. Now I want to give a little, well, first of all, let's deal with an apparent contradiction here. Okay, and let's look at the contradiction exactly right. If you turn to page 1110, at the end of the Torah in the stone Chumash, and this is the reference I made before to Devarim, the 5th book of the Torah, chapter 32, and you look at sentence 51, God repeats there, he's telling that this is when Moshe is told that he's going to die, ascend to the mountain of Avarim, Har Nevo, in Moab's land, you'll die on the mountain. And 51, because you trespassed against me among the children of Israel at the waters of strife and Kadesh in the wilderness of sin, because you did not sanctify me among the children of Israel. So again, this is a clear repetition. And clearly, Moshe is being criticized for missing a tremendous opportunity to sanctify God's name. Okay, Moshe did not disgrace God's name. Moshe did not act out in defiance of God. None of those things took place, but rather an opportunity that was deemed to be essential for the development of the Jewish people was missed, and therefore God's name was not sanctified. And as we've seen elsewhere in the Torah, God's name becomes sanctified through the punishment, the consequence that's meted out to Moshe and Aaron, that neither of them are able to lead the Jewish people into the land of Canaan, and instead Yehoshua leads them in. And that's the decree. Now, interesting to note, and we're going to get back to this at the end of the class, but when you look at the beginning of the book of Devarim, and I know we're looking at 3 different places in the Torah here, but we're all talking about the same thing. But if you turn to page 946 in the stone Chumash, which again is in the 5th book of the Torah where we just referred to, and if you look at chapter 1, sentence 35, 36, and 37, page 947 in English, you see something as well. Moshe is talking here about the sin of the spies, something that happened 38 years earlier. We'll pick up the narrative. Hashem heard the sounds of your words, your complaints, and he was incensed, and he swore, saying, if even a man of these people, this evil generation, shall see the good land that I swore to give to your forefathers, except for Kalev, the son of Yefuneh, he shall see the land, and to him shall I give the land on which he walked, and to his children. He was one of the spies because he followed Hashem wholeheartedly. And then Moshe adds in sentence 37, very significantly on page 947, with me as well Hashem became angry because of you, saying, you too shall not come there. Joshua, son of Nun, who stands before you, he shall come there. Strengthen him, for he shall cause Israel to inherit it. So here, in what seems to be a contradiction to the 2 sources we just read, chapter 20 in this week's Torah reading, which is the main accounting of the sin of hitting the rock and not speaking to it, and chapter 32 at the end of the Torah in Deuteronomy, which clearly says that Moshe is not going to go into the land because he hit the rock and did not speak to the rock. Here we get Moshe linking the punishment to the people for the sin of the spies and their lack of trust in God that they could conquer the land, their despair at not being able to conquer the land, saying that only Kalev would go in. I am not going to be able to go in because of you, and Joshua will come in. So we have a tension here that we will resolve, but not right away. So hold on to that thought for a moment. And one simple answer could be, just so that we don't have anybody bursting from the question, is that sometimes a main cause has a lighter antecedent cause. And it's like what tips the scales ultimately in causing something to happen. And that's explained. There's different opinions in the comments about that. Let's get back to our situation now. Back to chapter 20, this week's Torah reading. Back to page 843 in the Stone Chumash. What's the biggest question on Moshe being punished for hitting the rock and not speaking to the rock? What's the biggest question? Somebody would unmute themselves. What is the biggest problem with this text? Anybody? The biggest problem is that when God tells Moshe what to do due to the lack of water,
he says he should talk to it.
You should talk to it, but he says in sentence 8, take the staff, gather together the assembly, and speak to the rock. Okay, so it sounds like Moshe is being, perhaps, you might wonder, set up for failure, right? Because Moshe is in a very challenged position here. They're on the cusp of entering the land of Canaan. They've passed through all the hurdles. The generation of the spies has largely passed on and died out. They're close to the end. Miriam passes away, Moshe and Aaron's sister, personal tragedy. The Jewish people find themselves without water, clearly because it was Miriam's merit that provided them with water. And they panic, and they seemingly attack Moshe and Aaron with that old idea of, you must have messed up some way. This must be your fault because we're stuck out here, and wouldn't it have been better if we remained in Egypt? So Moshe and Aaron have to be thinking to themselves, oh my goodness, the next generation seems to be repeating the sins of the previous generation. We seem to be back in square one. It certainly sounds like an echo of the despair of the Jewish people following the sin of the spies coming back and giving an evil report and saying, FS, it's useless, we're never going to be able to conquer the land. Moshe and Aaron fall on their faces. Hashem gives them instructions. They go out with the staff in their hand as God instructed them to speak to the rock. Moshe, and let's just get the exact, if you turn over to page 845, sentence 9, Moshe took the staff from before Hashem as he had commanded him to do. Moshe and Aaron gathered the congregation before the rock, quite a pressured situation. And Moshe says to them, listen now, O rebels, shall we bring forth for you water from this rock? Moshe raises his arm and strikes the rock. So first of all, why would Moshe mess up like this? So it's pretty clear, according to most of the commentaries, that Moshe began by talking to the rock. And then nothing happened. The rock didn't come through for him. There's a delay here, there's a gap. And then Moshe became put in this position of seemingly failing to answer the challenge of the people, said, listen, you rebels, can I bring forth water? And he hit the rock. Now, what's the missing phrase here? Can I bring forth water? Shall we bring forth water from the rock? And he hits the rock. Clearly, there's a reference here on Moshe's part to the fact that, after all, who do you think Aaron and I are anyway? Who have we been this entire time? Let's even go back to the sin of the golden calf. We're not the God that took you out of Egypt. We're not, if you want to replace us, Replace us with someone like Yoshua to lead the people, but don't replace us with a golden calf. And don't start thinking this is the God that took us out of Egypt. All these things have to be swirling along when Moshe says, "Hear, O rebels," because there's again a rebellion taking place. The gap is that the rock is not cooperating. Moshe falls back in anger, according to many, anger or frustration, whatever the right word you want to use is. And he hits the rock twice, even hitting the rock twice. He wouldn't have hit the rock twice if it would have worked the first time. So Rashi has a whole scenario here. He spoke to the rock, no water came out. God wanted there to be a delay for the people to absorb what was going on. He hit the rock once, a few drops came out. Moshe thought, oh my goodness, maybe I'm not following through on God's instructions properly. He hits the rock a second time, water comes out in abundance. The thirst of the people is quieted, as are their claims and their despair. So at this point you say, Yan lo, because you did not sanctify me in the midst of the Jewish people. So we discussed once before, Rashi has a very esoteric idea here, and Rashi writes it out in his commentary and said they needed to just speak and speak and speak. And the Jewish people would have said, oh my goodness, look at this rock, where without being forced to comply with God's demand or command, and without even having any debt of gratitude to God, it listens to the words that Moshe and Aaron are speaking on behalf of God, and it brings forth water. Look how shameful our actions are with all that we owe God in terms of gratitude. And this is Rashi's approach, and we thought it through a couple of years ago in this class, and it's a complex approach. I want to introduce a different approach here, and that's the approach of the Das Zakenim Mibali Tosfos. It's from a few generations after Rashi. And here's what they say that's amazing. Their idea is that they conclude, and let's just get the facts straight, and then we'll see what the analysis here is. They conclude the following thought. Since God instructed Moshe to take the staff with him, certainly it was right for Moshe to hit the rock. Otherwise, he didn't need to bring the staff with him to begin with, if this was supposed to be such a different miracle than when Moshe hit the rock back in the book of Exodus. But what's ruined here is the fact that Moshe spoke out, listen now, O rebels, can I bring forth water from this rock? And instead, Moshe was expected to speak calmly, clearly to the Jewish people, gather them by the rock with the staff in his hand, which he was fully authorized to use. But Moshe was first to speak to them and say, ladies and gentlemen, something to this effect. I don't have a text in front of me, but this is the concept that the Das Zakenim put forward. We, the Jewish people, are living under God's providence. We saw the miracles in Egypt. We saw God take us out of Egypt miraculously. God brought us to Mount Sinai. God presented us with a Torah, elevating us to being a chosen, select people, meant to be the beacons of fulfillment of God's will to the world. And here we are. We're in a moment where we lack water. And I'm prepared, as God has instructed me to do, to bring forth water from a rock, certainly nothing that any human being in any natural sense could do. So it's going to be a miraculous deliverance yet again. Look what's going on, pay attention to what's going on. And then Moshe should have hit the rock. But Moshe circumvented the full explanation, and he didn't create the Kiddush Hashem, the pure sanctification of God's name that was meant to take place by him getting up while the people were thirsty, while the people were despairing, while the people themselves were calling out, were abandoned, were lost, echoes of everything that happened before with the spies. Moshe was meant at that point to speak to the hearts of the people and to explain to them who's in front of you that you should accost us. Aaron, me, who are we anyway but messengers of God? Who is it that took us out of Egypt? Who is it that gave us the Torah in Mount Sinai? Who is it that has sustained us for almost 40 years in a land where nothing grows, in a wilderness? Of course it's Hashem. And now once again, Hashem is certainly going to provide for us. There's no question about that. Let's just open our eyes and ears and learn from this experience and take it to heart. That's what was meant to take place according to the Das HaKenim. A very interesting approach. And what do we see from this? We see from this that a critical component of leadership and teaching and guidance is speaking out clearly a message that someone can take to heart. And it even applies to us vis-a-vis ourselves. You know, when a person is at a moment of immense gratitude to Hashem, a person should speak out, at least to yourself, certainly to people close to you. Wow, what a moment. Who would have imagined that I'd be standing here at the bar mitzvah of a great-grandchild, if a person has the merit to do that? Who would imagine that I would, with my own two eyes, live to see this take place? That should be, and it should be spoken and verbalized and articulated and made clear, because these are the moments that create within us a sanctification of God that is sustainable. And it's sustainable through, most of all, through words of explanation, through taking an idea to heart. And hence, the way it is understood that the Das HaKenim is putting forward their explanation of this whole chapter is, Yan lohem mantem bi raktisheni. You don't have enough belief to sanctify God's name that these words spoken properly at this moment would make such a difference. And it's not about speaking versus hitting. It's not about, it's a failure to maintain that perspective as leaders they were supposed to do. And in an interesting way, this can address the fact that Moshe, at the beginning of Devarim at Deuteronomy, pins his not being able to go into the land back to the sin of the spies. Because if you look there by the sin of the spies, a very interesting thing happened. And the sin of the spies takes place, it's page 802. I'm just going to refer to it here. A common denominator when the report came back and the spies said, Ephes ki azam, it's useless. Forget about it. We have no opportunity to go into the land of Canaan. The people are mighty and strong and we're weak and we have nothing going for us and it's beyond our reach and God can't even help us, although they didn't say it that way. That's what they were leaning to. Both there and at this moment when the people cried out for water, it says, Vayipol Moshe v'Aaron al pneim. That's what it says by the spies. And here it says, Vayiplu al pneim. In both cases, Moshe and Aaron prostrated themselves before God's presence in the tent of meeting. They felt speechless to respond. And perhaps that's why when Moshe gives that speech in the beginning of Devarim of Deuteronomy chapter 1, sentences, we refer to it, I'm sorry, when Moshe gives that speech, he differentiates between Kalev and Yoshua. Moshe says, Kalev merits going to the land, but not this generation of the spies. He's repeating the story. And I am not able to lead you into the land. And here we'll add, because of my not speaking up. And Yehoshua will lead you. Because if you look at the details by the spies, it's Kalev singularly who responds to the charge of the spies. and says their despair is ridiculous. The same God who took us out of Egypt and who gave us the Torah can lead us into the land. Let's move on. Kalev shows his leadership through words, through articulating exactly what it is that the issue at hand needs to be addressed. We have the strength. We have Hashem's help. Let's go up to the land now and conquer it. And this is a hint of what leadership requires. It requires speaking things out. It requires addressing matters forthrightly and directly. And I dare say we are leaders of ourselves, and it requires us to speak the same way to ourselves. And this is the big lesson here. And that's where Moshe is impugning himself as being caught up in the sin of the spies and distinguishing himself from Kalev, because he's calling attention subtly to the idea that Kalev spoke out, that as much as despair and was being heaped on them by the 10 spies, Kalev had the temerity to get up and say, no, we can go up to the land now and we can conquer it because Hashem is with us. And Moshe is highlighting that that's what needed to be said. He's not the one who said it. Kalev said it. Yehoshua also stood by Kalev's side. Yehoshua also brought back a positive report. So he and Kalev will be the two exceptions to the generation who will go onto the land with no one else, not even me. That's the explanation there. And I just want to add a final thought to this class. Something really remarkable, which is taught by the Maharal Prague in his super commentary to Rashi, and it's brought down in a book called Chidushei Alev by the Rosh Hashiva of Chavetz Chaim. And this is a different nuance here. He stresses the idea where Moshe said, listen now, O rebels, bring forth, can we bring forth from the rock? And hitting the rock. He says Moshe's very demeanor, which spoke of frustration and anger and concern in the manner in which he acted with the rock, was itself a lack of emunah b'Hashem, of faith and trust in God. And the Maharal said something very remarkable here. The Maharal says that when someone is imbued with trust and belief in God, his demeanor always remains calm. It always remains thoughtful. Because after all, who's steering the ship anyway? Who's ultimately responsible for the outcome of everything is God. And at best, I'm God's representative, or I am given the opportunity to, quote unquote, act on God's behalf and speak up and say what has to be said and put forward what needs to be said. So the Maharal says it was the fact that Moshe could become angry and could feel this kind of pressure and could, in a sense, become rash, and I use the word rash in quotation marks, in his demeanor here. Says that's the failure to sanctify God with a showing of trust and emunah. Because a person with emunah has a certain inner calm and a certain inner serenity, and in a certain sense is going in the flow of God's plan for the world, and is always imbued with that idea, striving, thinking, always questioning, is this the right thing to do? Is this the responsible thing to do? Is this what God really wants me to do? But always with a sense of ultimate reliance on God, which brings about a sense of calm. And what the Maharal says, it brings about a sense of joy and happiness. And therefore, another lesson for us, when we lose that, especially in service to God, if we become frustrated during davening, or we become angry when we're trying to honor our parents or do something else that's meritorious for a person to do, we have to realize that means that there's a breakdown and a failure in our connection with God, even while we think we're carrying out God's instructions. Also a big lesson, also something to take to heart. So I think what we see here is a certain demeanor that trust in God requires of us, and the tremendous opportunity it gives us to always sanctify God's name in this world, and the idea of the responsibility we have to open our mouths and articulate what's going on whenever necessary for the benefit of everybody that's there. And of course, by implication, even a Moshe and an Aaron could, under extreme duress, fall short in terms of God's measurement of what God expected to take place in terms of the display of trust and belief in God, and this ability to communicate the message that God wanted people to learn over to the people. Very, very important lessons, and please God, we'll all take them to heart and apply them to ourselves. Any questions? Okay, and Zoom is telling us we're almost out of time, so I will quickly wish everybody well. Thank you very much for joining, and please God, we should each give some more thought to this, the importance of these ideas, and see how they can apply to us and make us better. Thank you.
Rabbi, can I just make one comment?
Sure.
Frank, go ahead first, because I may run out of time.
I don't have a question.
Oh, thank you. I think somewhere, the philosophy is, amongst Jews, is that you always follow a middle road in any emotion, I guess, other than two. One is humility, where you're supposed to show utmost humility, and anger, where you're supposed to show none. Everything else, you're supposed to be moderate, right? Is that correct?
Yeah, even anger, when it's not anger burning within you, but it's a show of anger, says that a teacher is permitted to show anger toward a student if he feels that it's the only way the student will take to heart what he's conveying.
Oh, really? Okay.
That's a big caveat. I mean, I think, for example, I heard Rav Schwab talk about punishing your child. He said, someone asked him, were you ever hit as a child? He says, yes, I was hit as a child. My father would take me into a different room so I wouldn't be embarrassed in front of anybody else. He would say to me, give me your hand, and I would give him my hand, and he would slap me in the back of the hand and says, I'm hitting you, and that was the extent of the hit, to convey to you the seriousness with which you need to change what you just did. That was the type of corporal punishment that Rav Schwab grew up with in his house in Germany. So I mean, in that sense, anger is permitted, but humility, right? The Maimonides says for humility, a person should go to the other extreme, which also has to be understood, because having no sense of self-worth and self-respect is definitely not what Maimonides is talking about when he talks about extreme humility.
Yeah, I think it was C.J. Lewis that said, humility is not thinking less about yourself, but thinking more of others.
Right. Right. That's what a good friend of mine told me. Rabbi Sachs said, humility is what do you say? Yeah, something to that effect. Not thinking less of yourself, but thinking more about others. That's a good way of putting it. I don't remember the exact quote. Absolutely. So you have a question based on this, on what we talked about?
No, I just wanted to clarify the issue of anger.
Right.
If it is something you shouldn't.
Anger comes from frustration. Look, that's the philosophical question when the Torah says that God became angry. How could God become angry? God has all the cards. I'm angry because for some reason I didn't get elected president a couple of years ago. But God's not in that category of being subject to anything else happening to God, so to speak. So that's why anger needs to be understood as a way of conveying extreme importance or whatever. I've thought about it recently. I talked to my wife once about it, but I don't have it so clear at this moment. Okay. Zoom is telling us all to have a good night.
All right. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you. Everybody should be well.
You
Bye-bye.
too. Bye.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.
Good night.
Night.
Thank you.